Hello, my name is Roy Canterbury. I'm going to be your host today on Archery Talk 101. What you're going to learn today is what does paper tuning really tell you? Uh, First, we want to start off with what do you need to know about paper tuning? So let's start off with where to place the target. At what distance are you going to want to place the target? Well, generally you're going to be from 4 to 6 feet from where you're standing is where you want the paper to be set. Uh, Now, if you're testing to see if the spine is correct, you'd start out at 4 to 6 feet, then maybe move to 10 feet, 15 feet. What you're looking for here is a tear that might be tearing to the left, a little bit further down range, it tears to the right. And then by the time you get down your 20 yards, it's straight. And that indicates your arrow is fishtailing. So it starts off a little bit of the wrong angle, and then it kind of overcorrects, and it just kind of goes back and forth until it finally straightens out. Because the fletching on there, it will eventually straighten out. Now, what height do you put the target? Now that you want to have right at your form. So as your arm is off to the side, pointing straight out, that's where you want to have the target at that height. So it's roughly about shoulder height is where it's going to be, because as you change your form, if you're shooting down or shooting up and you just drop your arm, that is going to affect the way it shoots. And just by having bad form, that could cause you to have tears that you're going to try and work to get out. Now, here's one of the methods of doing is bare shaft tuning. What that is when you remove all the fletching from the arrow and just shoot the bare shaft. Uh, that way you don't have to worry about the fletching hitting the rest. A lot of finger shearers will start off this way because it takes the fletching out of the equation. It allows you to figure out, where do I need the knock point and a few things like that. Now then, you can also do that on compounds, start off that way. And then when you put the fletching on there, now then it's going to tell you other problems. So a little bit about your fletching alignment. Now, your fletching is going to help stabilize your arrow. Like I alluded to a little bit earlier, your fishtailing, eventually that arrow will straighten out because the fletching is going to help stabilize it, the more drag in the back. The exception to not having any fletching hitting your contact, you don't want to have any of it hitting because then that kicks the arrow out a different way. The exception is like with your whisker biscuits, there you have 100% contact with the fletching. So if you're shooting feathers that kind of fold out of the way pretty good, if you're shooting veins are messed up, then it can cause a little bit of a problem. So, starting off with a bare shaft isn't a bad idea, because then when you put fletching on, if you're getting good arrow flight with no fletching, put fletching on it, you're getting bad flight, then there's an indication that your fletching is coming in contact with your rest. Now, your fletching, if you had problems with that tuning, after you put the fletching on, that is most likely your problem you're running into. So just take a look into that. Now, if you're going to shoot with your fletching on, you want to shoot with multiple arrows until you find some that get the same tear. Because if the knock is aligned a little bit off on one and not on the other one, because on a lot of unless they're glued on knocks, you can rotate those knocks. When you put them in, they could easily be turned. Not really easy, but you can turn them, in which case they're going to line up differently and have a little bit different. So if, say you're shooting 5 arrows and you're getting 3 of them are tearing high and the other 2 make a different tear. Well, I'd probably say that those 3 are consistent and throughout the other 2. Don't have to worry about those, just try working with those 3. And then take a look at the other 2 that aren't flying the same and see if you can see what's different about them. Because there's probably something different. You want to make sure all your arrows are fletched identical. Now, once again, if your fletching is hitting your rest, you're going to get erratic arrow flight because it's going to be kicking it out one direction or the other, depending on which fletching is hitting. So, that's why it's important to tune with one arrow. I'd recommend just getting one arrow and tune with it until you get good flight with that, and then start going to add another one in. If you're not getting the same flight, see what the difference is, and then tune for that. Because the knock alignment could be different. Your fletching could be fletched a little bit different depending on if you're fletching with one jig or multiple jigs. If you have one jig that you're fletching with all your arrows, then they're all fletched identical. If you're like me, I've got a dozen different fletching jigs, and each one could be slightly different. So if you get one that flies erratically, if you note which jig it was done on, number them. If your jig's got 1 through 12, number your arrows 1 through 12, and that if all of a sudden number 6 is always off, then that jig is set just a little bit differently than the rest of them. That's why you can keep everything straight. So that's one of the things you want to look at too. That can be a problem that you can run into and not have anything, any idea of what's causing it. Now, what are methods of tuning you should do? We alluded a little bit earlier. Finger shooters, you almost always want to start off with bare shaft tuning. Then compound shooters using release aid, or if you're using a release aid on a recurve or a long bow. I have seen people do that before too, just because, your finger, your pinches, and sometimes you can't do it. So I've seen those. So if you're going to use a release aid, you want to use a loop that you hook the release to. This will help prevent some knock pinching that can go on, and it gives you a much better consistent release. Now, a tip to help you see your fletching, see if your fletching is hitting the rest, would be to spray like some foot powder onto it. It's a powder, or even a baby powder, attacking powder, put it on there. And as you shoot, you're going to see if the rest is hitting the fletching at any place. Sometimes just regular like baby powder, when you shoot, a lot of it will come off. There may be enough stuck on there. That's with the spray. There's a little bit of stickiness, so it'll stick onto it. And if you see any part of your fletching getting touched, or if you've been shooting, all of a sudden you're seeing, for some reason, you're seeing black marks on your veins, they're starting to wrinkle up. That's a sign that your fletching is hitting your rest and needs to be adjusted. Now, before we get started, the better your form, the more accurate the results. Gripping the bow can cause a tear. Punching the trigger can cause a tear. So if you're having trouble getting it tuned in, it could be your form. So you want to pay attention to that. People like to grip their bow. You see them, their knuckles turn white. They're gripping the bow. If you twist your wrist slightly, it's going to put them off at an angle. So now it's going to be shooting. So that's why you want to work on your form in there in your shooting. Now, a little bit on what equipment you're going to need. You're going to need some paper to shoot through. I'll put a link to a couple I found on Amazon in the description. One's just a little cardboard one frame with you put paper in the middle of it. The other was a metal frame that you have a big roll which you pull down. Basically, all you need is a piece of paper suspended and held at the top and bottom. That way, it's held straight. If it's free floating, as the arrow goes through, it's going to take the bottom and move it up, and it's going to look like it's got a bad tear. So you want to either staple it down or tape it down or something. But you can even just cut a frame out of some cardboard and put paper over it. You could tape it down or staple it to it. As long as it's held solid, that's all you really need. Now, what can shooting through the paper tell you? Now, the reason you're going through and shooting through the paper is to see how your knock, point, and your rest are set up. So by looking at the tear, you'll be able to see if the knock is correct, the rest is aligned, and even your spine. You can even use it for testing the spine of your arrow. So here's what a perfect hole looks like. When you shoot through the paper, all you should see is the 3 lines made up by your fletching. At the center of those lines, you'll have a single round hole. Now that is what you're looking for when you shoot through it. You see just the hole in the center, but the 3 tears from your fletching. Now, if you're using 4 fletch or 2 fletch, you're going to have either 2 or 4 lines in there. Now, what does a tear high indicate? Now, let me describe what a tear high is. When you get a tear, that is high, you will see the hole, the tip made, and two lines created by the two fletching. Basically, this looks like an arrow pointing down. So if it looks like the arrow is kind of pointing down, then you're indicating a hair tie. And the fixes you might try would be move your rest up. Look at the location of the arrow when sitting on the rest. For dropaways, you'll have to put the rest in the up position because it's normally down. So flip it up and then look and see where the arrow is. It should be basically centered or slightly above the mounting bolt that you're mounting your rest on. That is where you want to take a look and see, where it's at. If it's sitting down low, below it, or if it's sitting way up above it, then it's too high. So you might want to get that set first. And if that is set right, then you want to move on to look at the knock point. You want to move it down. After you've checked the rest, make sure that's right. Then you go on to the knock point. The arrow should form a 90-degree angle to the string. So as you're looking at the arrow, it should be a 90-degree angle to the string. Now, when we set those up, I set them up with levels. So I have the string is plumb and the arrow is level. That gives you a 90-degree angle rather than trying to look at it or putting a square or something on there. Now, if you're using a loop, which is what I recommend for anybody using a release, is instead of a knock point, you have your loop tied on. You can turn that clockwise or counterclockwise to move it a little bit. This allows for small minor adjustments. You don't want to make big ones anyway, because it could just be, off by just a little bit causing it. And depending on which way you turn it and which way your serving is wrapped around, it's going to move that knock point up or move it down. Now, if all that isn't making that change to making it work right, then what you want to look at is decreasing your tip weight. If you have too much of a tip weight, you have way too much forward weight, and you might try a lighter tip. So let's say you have a light shaft and use 150 grain tip. You might try going to 125 or 100 grain tip and see if that helps. Now, if what you're shooting that don't allow you that, then you might have to make, a little more drastic change. And the next option would be to shorten your arrow length. Now, this should be the last resort because you're either going to have to cut the fletching off and cut on the knock end and refletch it, or you're going to have to cut it down far enough to take your insert out because it's glued in. So that means you're going to have to cut it short enough to get past the insert. Then you're going to have to either, try and clean up that insert, or best thing is just replace it with a new insert. So that's kind of your last resort, is to try shortening your shaft, because that's the most drastic, and it's hard to go back from that, because if you cut it too short, then you might have another problem, and then your arrows aren't going to work. So there you want to look and see how much does it stick out in front of your hand. You normally want your arrow sticking out in front of your hand so that if for some reason it falls off, it doesn't fall onto your hand, it's in front of your hand. Because if you make a mistake and don't realize it, you pull that trigger and it's sitting on your hand, it's going to shoot it through your hand. So that's why I always recommend it be in front of your hand. Now, if it's sticking out 3-4 inches in front of it, unless you're still growing, if it's like for a kid, you may want to have a little bit longer, just because as they grow, you don't have to keep buying new arrows, every few months when they grow longer. Now, normally the first two options, moving the rest of the knock point, is going to solve majority of your problems, because that's just what I've seen over the years. That is the main thing you want to look at. Now, what does a tear low indicate? Now, let me describe what a tear low is. Best it's opposite of your high. You tear low, the tip hits higher than the fletching. So this looks like an arrow pointing up. That's a tear low. And the way to fix this is basically just raise your knock point. That's pretty much about the only thing you're really going to do. Change that knock point. You might take a look at the rest to make sure that it's where it should be. because it could be sitting down, where it's really off, and then you're going to get a tear anyway. So now let's go into what a tear left looks like and indicates. Now this is when the tip hits to the right of the fletching. Looks like an arrow pointing to the right. Now the fixes for this would be to move your rest to the right. Now that'd be towards right, the riser on right-handed bow, and of course, away from the riser on the left-handed bow. Your spine might be too weak. That could be one thing, and it's no. So you want to select, maybe a stiffer spine arrow, or decrease your draw weight. That's one of the things that you can do. And yeah, that's pretty much about what you're going to do with a tear left. You're going to adjust the rest. Now then, let's go on to what does a tear right indicate. Now first, let's describe it. Now this is when a tip of the arrow hits to the left of the fletching. This looks like an arrow pointing to the left. Now, that's a tear right. Kind of weird how tear right arrow points left. It's different that way. Now the fix for this is to move your rest left. Now on right-handed bows, you're going to move it away from the riser for a right-handed bow. Left-handed one's going to be a little bit different. So that's kind of a little bit about paper tuning, why you want to do it, why you don't want to do it. What I found, if you have the bow set up correctly, you really don't need to do much paper tuning. As we've done this a lot of times, we use laser to set up the center shot on it, line it up on the string, clear out to the tip. That gives me the perfect left-right position. I use levels on the arrow and the string to make sure we get a 90-degree angle, and then it takes most of this out. And so that's what I do when I set them up. Not everybody's going to have the laser. They're expensive to set those up and don't have a lot. So if you don't have the levels and stuff, or even have someplace that can hold the bow, you want to look at that. Just remember that if your form is off, you can still have the bow set up perfectly and still get bad tears. So you want to take a look at that. And I have a couple links to a couple of paper tuning things in the link in the description below. They're simple to make. You can use just about anything to set up, as long as you have the paper held solid top and bottom. Shoot through it. If you have any questions or any other advice you'd like to have, you can go out to the Archery Talk 101 Facebook group, and there you can post questions. You can upload your videos, and people can critique what's going on and give you some pointers. And I also record this podcast in a video format. Some days there's really not much there, and other days they have a little bit more information on it. But you can also watch it on video. You can get that the video from the Facebook group, or you can go out to my YouTube channel, and I'll post them out there. But let's go. This is Roy Canterbury. I've been your host today on Archery Talk 101, and enjoy this. If you have any questions on paper tuning, just contact me on the Facebook group.